Germans are celebrating. 20 years of unity. Following 4 decades of division. In the next 30 minutes,
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
the fall of the Berlin Wall.
It was something in the air.
The collapse of communism.
I believed always that this system will have no future.
The end of the Cold War.
There was a feeling that, this might end up to be a hot war.
A long journey for those who lived it.
We hated the war.
This was a NATO meeting.
And one-on-one with the 2 Houstonians who had a hand in history.
This was the fait accompli. This was a big thing.
The world that I had known all of my adult life changed the day the wall came down.
This is an ABC 13 Community Close-Up, a special program presentation with Christine Dobbyn.
Guten Tag, willkommen in Berlin, Deutschland. Hello and welcome to Berlin, Germany. I'm standing in front of Brandenburg Gate, one of the most recognized symbols in Berlin and Germany. 20 years ago, it literally marked the division between the East and the West, communism and democracy. But on a November day in 1989, in what may be remembered as one of the most peaceful revolutions in modern history, the wall came crumbling down. Berlin was reborn and Germany eventually reunified. It was a day that changed the world we all live in today.
This November, Germans are reliving this celebration. It was a moment in time they will always remember.
Every time if I think the date, the 9th of November when the wall came down, I have to fight against tears.
Celebrating the whole night and crying.
But the road to here was more than 40 years long. After World War II, Germany was divided between the major Allied powers. The Soviet Union occupied the East, known as the GDR, German Democratic Republic. The US, France, and Great Britain controlled the West, the Federal Republic of Germany. The city of Berlin was split between the two. Former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill described this division in his famous 1946 speech.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent.
It was the beginning of the Cold War, where Americans braced themselves for the threat of a nuclear attack. As communism clamped down on Eastern Europe, millions began fleeing in the 1950s, many of them young and well-educated, and the GDR leaders feared the impact of this brain drain.
It was a dictatorial system under a different guise, under the guise of representing the people. It was a huge lie, but they succeeded.
The Eastern government began with barbed wire and guards. When that wasn't enough, they built a wall.
It was a symbol of the division of the world between two blocks, the communist bloc and the Western bloc.
The wall that came down in 1989 was a much larger structure than what was initially built. As East Germans tried to flee, the GDR government reinforced the wall again and again. There were actually 3 sections. This was what the middle section looked like. In the end, it was 96 miles long. That's about the distance from Houston to Port Arthur.
As West Berlin was closed off, families were torn apart. Hundreds risked their lives trying to escape. Today it is marked by crosses and memorials recognizing the sacrifices some were willing to make for freedom. Almost 200 died trying to cross the border.
president walks to the viewing stand, erected for him about 50 yards from the wall.
The United States was quick to push back with its policies. President John F. Kennedy was the first to visit Berlin after the wall was built.
All free men, wherever they may live, are citizens of Berlin. And therefore, as a free man, I take pride in the words, Ich bin ein Berliner.
More than 20 years later, another firm stand by a U.S. president.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
That was symbolically the beginning of the unraveling.
President Reagan's speech was followed by peace marches from Leipzig to East Berlin. The darkness of communism was awakened by their candles for democracy. The Eastern government was collapsing, and the Soviets would not provide reinforcement.
The use or threat of force can no longer be an instrument of foreign policy.
Let's go! The timing of the fall of the wall was not planned, but almost an accident after a low-level East German official said at a news conference that travel restrictions to the West would be lifted. The government had no idea it would spark a stampede to the West that very night. The people rushed to border checkpoints and chiseled away at the wall. Communism was collapsing, the Cold War was ending, and Germany was facing a new beginning.
The timing of the fall of the wall was somewhat of a surprise, but not totally unexpected. The world was watching as Germans passed through gates and checkpoints like the one just behind me, open now for the first time in 28 long years. The eyes of Washington were also looking on. Reunifying Germany had been a goal of U.S. policy for years, but it was two Houstonians who made sure it happened.
And that wall stands as a monument to the failure of communism. It must come down. Now,
and when it did, President George H.W. Bush had been in the White House 11 months.
we'd had some indication that, that it was crumbling or about to crumble, but this was the fait accompli. This was a big thing.
The president and his Secretary of State, James Baker, had been closely watching what was taking place.
How unexpected was the timing of it? Did anybody anticipate that November that this was going to happen?
No, it came very quickly.
There were uncertain days as the president and Secretary of State saw the opening of opportunity firsthand.
Secretary, what did you think of the wall?
I'm glad to see that there are a lot of openings in that wall.
Tonight we stand at the crossroads of history on our way to a Europe made whole and free.
The president and Secretary of State knew that window of opportunity could close as quickly as it opened.
We started talking about what this meant and what we would do.
Not everything came easy. President Bush faced criticism in the days following the collapse of the wall.
You made a point not to gloat in the face of the Soviets. Yes. Why was that so important?
Well, the leaders of the Congress, George Mitchell and Gephardt, Bush, the president, doesn't get it. He won't even go and dance on the wall with the Germans that are rejoicing. Well, it wasn't the stupidest thing I could have done, and Gorbachev has since confirmed that it would have been horrible for him had I, representing the United States, gone over and stuck my finger in his eyes publicly like that.
And while this American duo believed East and West Germany should be reunified, not everyone was behind them. The Soviets were faced with the prospect of losing their superpower status.
The British and the French, our longtime allies in all of the wars that we fought in the last century in Europe, were likewise unenthusiastic, worried that history might repeat itself.
And there were more relationships crucial to returning Germany to the status of one nation. Many leaders reached over hard historical lines. Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev pulled back the reins.
President Gorbachev deserves credit for being...
The Soviets ultimately came to the conclusion that they were not willing to keep the empire together by force.
Gorbachev was very forward-looking, and we had to work very closely with him to be sure he knew we weren't trying to capitalize on Russia, make them look weak.
President Bush stood with West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl in the belief it was in the best interest of the people to be one united Germany, even though absorbing the East economically would be difficult. Secretary Baker earned the trust of his Soviet counterpart, Edward Shevardnadze.
He had a vision, and it included working closely with the United States, and it included going along with and advocating a unification of Germany.
It was due to the fact that Gorbachev and Shevardnadze renounced the use of force, and Bush 41 and Kohl were close partners.
20 years later, they still share a unique trust and will for freedom. President and Mrs. Bush reunited in Berlin with former President Gorbachev and Chancellor Kohl.
I'm so happy to see you. I am too happy to see you.
How are you, old friend?
Our cameras were behind the scenes when the three met for the first time in years for a photo shoot. They signed books and placed their names on a remaining section of the wall.
Mr. President, what's it like to be reunited with these two men?
Wonderful, because you see, I consider them friends, not only world leaders, but friends.
Very exciting for all of us. Big day for Berlin.
Former President Gorbachev appeared humbled by the experience, saying he did not feel all these cameras pointed at him were necessary.
But perhaps we're valuable in as much that we're very historical figures that were there at a time when things were changing, when we did everything to stop the Cold War, and people want to know about us and to remember us.
The three also shared the stage for the 20th anniversary at a theater in the former East.
Of course, we're gathered today because it fell to the leading governments of the time to respond to the historic events of 1989 in ways that fostered this rare manifestation of human aspiration.
And I would like to tell the young people that these lessons of the past must be kept alive. They were horrible times.
There have never been such relations like my relations with these two gentlemen. So this was really God sent.
This was also something important for me.
Many Germans believed it might be their last chance to say thank you in person.
Be a once-in-a-lifetime experience.
I think it's the last time that you could see the most important statesman in the 20th century.
Secretary Baker hosted the foreign ministers who had a hand in reunifying Germany at the Baker Institute at Rice University.
The Cold War really did not have to end peacefully. It could have ended with a bang instead of a whimper, but it ended with a whimper.
Do you believe that the right leaders were in the right place at the right time at that point in history?
Somebody else can speak about the right leader in the United States, but I know we had the right leader in Germany, with whom I work very closely, and of course Russia. To have Mikhail Gorbachev there is so different than what would have happened if we had Khrushchev or Brezhnev or someone else.
To the world, the wall was a symbol of political differences. To East and West Germans, and especially East and West Berliners, it tore families apart. Today, there is a generation who doesn't even know the wall. Others remember it going up and coming down.
Heaven be thanks for this.
In the pages of Albrecht Stormer's diary, just a few words say it all.
Die Mauer fällt, die Mauer fällt. The wall falls.
November 9th, 1989 is a day marked in the memories of all who called Germany home. Albrecht and Northrud Stormer experienced life in the East firsthand.
The Communist Party was very, very hard, and the security was very, very hard. You couldn't say your meaning, and many, many people were in prison.
The two were part of the almost 3 million people who fled to West Germany in the 1950s, before the wall was built in 1961.
In 2 days,
1 day, 2 days, the wall was there.
We knew this regime, this communist regime, will have no future.
Albrecht Stormer was right, but what he did not predict was the date in his diary.
I didn't believe that I will, during my lifetime, that was, thanks God.
When the Stormer's son Matthias was born in the 1960s, the wall firmly stood between East and West Berlin. He realized how it affected lives at just 16 when he met a girl on a train named Zirka.
We exchanged addresses first, and so we wrote letters a lot.
The two began dating, but it wasn't easy. He could go to the East, but she could never go to the West. Their relationship became even more difficult when they had a daughter in 1987.
I think the East German officials said, well, if you want to visit your friend in the West, you can come, but the daughter stays here.
November 9th is really an anniversary for them, too.
Like a liberation. It was like a liberation.
Today, that little girl that could never come to the West to visit her father is now 22.
It was not an easy time for my grandparents and my parents.
Josephine is part of the post-wall generation, just 2 years old when the wall came down.
For my generation, there's no classification of East or West, and think all together.
Her younger sister Constanze was born 10 years later.
Going to a Halloween party.
She is still learning English, so she read what she wanted to say.
I think it's great that there is no wall anymore. I want peace, and I'm from Leipzig.
Today, generations of the Stormers live in both the Old East and West, now a united and free Germany. And while they all bring different perspectives here to the kitchen table, there is no question it is boldly marked in their family's past.
A miracle has happened.
Has happened after 28 years.
After 28 years.
Yeah.
Mein Herz ist nicht mehr mein, oh, könnte ich bei dir sein.
Gottfried Schiller has a lot to sing about today. The former East German now calls the Houston Heights home. The only wall left in his life is what he calls his wall of remembrance.
Farm in Germany.
That's where you grew up?
Yeah, where I grew up.
The Eastern government took ownership of his family's farm.
We didn't like the system. My parents didn't like the system.
The opera singer was one of thousands who chipped away at the wall on that November night.
They cried. Everybody cried there. We still have some.
Today, he literally has a bag of pieces of his past.
You can see that's basically where your world ends, period.
Thomas Kletke owns his own IT company in Houston, a dream that would have never been possible for the former East German teacher if the border had not opened.
Imagine this, I mean, there is a border somewhere through the middle of Houston here, and you're never going to go on the other side. You can see these buildings there because they are clearly above the whole thing, but you know you're not going to go in there.
Kletke has a stack of passports and IDs from the days he lived under the Eastern government.
Big Brother was everywhere, and you would learn from early childhood there are certain things that you say in public and certain things that are better not said in public.
The fall of the wall opened the door of opportunity. While he is still grateful, 20 years later, he says it is almost impossible to recreate the emotions of that November night.
But I have never seen the spirit, any kind of spirit like this.
And they were opening up these parts of the wall.
Ellen Hansbach remembers the emotion too, but she was just 13 when the border between East and West Berlin opened.
I really remember the day going to school very clearly, and that there was something in the air.
The West Berlin native has spent time in Houston working at local art museums, a long way from the pain she recalls seeing in the eyes of her relatives while they were divided from loved ones.
You couldn't just leave the city easily.
But time has worked in Ellen's favor.
I remember that there were these two Germanys, but that I was young enough, and that the friends that I made then in the East were young enough, that for me, that separation never really happened.
Back at Gottfried Schiller's Heights home, he says his life could be written in two separate songs. The dark days the wall was up.
It's open. It's completely open. They can do what they want.
And the happiness and freedom after.
Tag ist nicht so heiter, so liebreich gar nicht mehr.
This November is a special time for Germans as they turn back and look forward. You can still see so many signs of the past in this city. Just below me, these stones mark where the wall used to be. If it still existed today, it would run right through this building. Germany was not officially reunified until almost a year after the wall came down, and it was a task that would not be easy.
This month, Germany marked the anniversary of the fall of the wall with the celebration in front of Brandenburg Gate. 1,000 giant dominoes lining the wall's former location fell to the ground to symbolize the events of 2 decades ago. Germany has come a long way in merging its 2 former countries, but it is Berlin that really had the toughest path. A path still visible today. The double cobblestone line marks where the wall stood, now overshadowed by progress and large buildings in the heart of the city. There are more places where history has a more subtle mark. Here at the cemetery in the former West, these trees line the wall's former path. In the former East, families now bike and run on this recreation trail that runs along the former border. You can still find a few remains of the wall. The longest stretch is the East Side Gallery, which stretches almost a mile by the Spree River. Today, thousands of visitors come to see the wall, which is now used as a canvas for artists from around the world.
The city is not now free, and the people can be everywhere like they want.
Today at the Berlin Wall Museum, they are preserving a part of the wall that includes the death strip, an area of raked gravel which made footprints easy to detect. There are places where gunshots were fired at those who tried to escape. Now filled with the sounds of children at this Potsdamer Platz Carnival. A Sugarland native and her German boyfriend were part of the festive crowd.
The kids that grew up here, their parents were involved with the wall, and they went through things that many of us don't know how to deal with.
And when you imagine this whole place here, this whole thing, everything here was all plain here, was all sand. So it's really interesting to everybody, I think, to see that now.
It's very new. Okay.
While Bianca Spingler grew up in the Free West, the wall was no less intrusive.
But you saw all the guards, and they were with cameras, and you saw them zooming on you because everybody who came close to the wall was pictured.
And today, the former location of the wall is still a clear picture in Bianca's head.
It was no man's land, wall, behind it, nothing.
Bianca Spingler says there is still somewhat of a ghost in the minds of many Germans.
Unfortunately, there's still that wall in our heads. You know, it's still like the East and the West.
She still thinks about the wall every time she walks by its former location.
It's still a miracle to me. It's nothing that taken for granted.
I don't have this feeling like in the past.
Monica Groth lived it in the East, the wall just 100 meters from her flat.
Right down there.
Yes,
the border.
right there.
Time has erased some scars from the past.
It's the feeling is really different because I can't imagine with a border.
She recalls waiting years. Just to buy one record of her favorite artist, Barbra Streisand.
Only one LP I could buy in the GDR time.
She has spent the past 2 decades traveling the world, and not just listening to Barbra Streisand on her sole album, but watching her in concert. That was impossible years ago.
You look across and think, my God, this was a divided family from family, and now it's together.
It is unity these 2 American leaders always believed was possible.
How far have they come? How far do they still have to go?
Well, they've come all the way politically.
That's historic. They're Germans, and it's decided.
Today, almost 1 million people a year come to the Checkpoint Charlie Museum to learn the history of the wall.
It's very important to remember of all of this, because without past, no future.
They can see firsthand the extremes some East Germans went to, from hidden compartments in cars to boxes and suitcases. Alexandra Hildebrandt is carrying on the legacy of her late husband, who founded the museum and believed freedom is always something to celebrate.
Every day, every hour after the wall was down is anniversary. Every day of freedom is anniversary.
Today it is hard for many Germans to even imagine what their lives would be like had the wall not fallen on that November day. They would still be a divided country. This November, they celebrate their unity, and millions around the world are celebrating with them. For more web clips and emotional interviews, plus my extensive interviews with President George H.W. Bush and Secretary of State James Baker, go to our website, abc13.com. Reporting for this Community Close-Up, I'm Christine Dobbyn in Berlin, Germany.